little while back, I had a kind of a vacation with a bunch of men in a big place away out yonder, and while I...
This plastic surgeon who met Elvis admitted Elvis wanted to look like. There are secrets that die in operating rooms. Whispered confessions between a patient and a surgeon that never make it past those four walls, not because there's no story to tell, but because the story is too big, too strange, too human to survive the noise of the outside world. For decades, one of those secrets belonged to the most famous face on the planet. And the man who held it? He wasn't a journalist, wasn't a biographer, wasn't some tabloid source looking for a payday. He was a surgeon. A man who had been trusted with something more intimate than money, more vulnerable than fame. He had been trusted with the face itself. His name isn't one you'd recognize at a party. That was the point. In the world he operated in, Beverly Hills in its most golden, most dangerous era, the best surgeons were the ones nobody talked about. They worked in the quiet spaces between ambition and insecurity, between the person you were and the person Hollywood needed you to become. They kept records that were never filed, performed procedures that were never logged, and carried memories that were never shared. Not until the end, not until there was nothing left to protect. This particular surgeon gave an interview late in his life, a small one, the kind that gets buried under entertainment news and celebrity gossip and never trends, never goes viral, never gets clipped and shared in the way it deserves. Most people who watched it moved on without understanding what they just heard. But buried inside that conversation, almost offhandedly, almost casually, the way people reveal enormous truths when they've finally stopped being afraid, he said something about Elvis Presley that should have stopped the world. He didn't say it dramatically. He didn't lean forward in his chair or lower his voice. He simply said it, the way you'd describe the weather, the way you'd tell someone what you had for breakfast, and somehow that made it worse. Because the calm in his voice told you this wasn't a story he'd constructed for attention. This was a memory he'd carried for 50 years that had finally gotten too heavy to hold alone. Now, before we get to what he said, and we will get there, all of it, you need to understand the world Elvis was living in when he walked into that office. Because context isn't just background noise here. Context is everything. By the time Elvis began seriously exploring cosmetic procedures, he was already the most recognized human being on the face of the earth. There was no city he could walk through, no restaurant he could eat in, no mirror he could stand in front of without the entire weight of global mythology staring back at him. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a symbol, and symbols, it turns out, are one of the loneliest things a person can become. The people around Elvis, and there were always people around Elvis, had a financial interest in keeping him exactly as he was. The hair, the jaw, the lips, the voice, the presence. Managers, promoters, record executives, handlers whose entire livelihood depended on the image remaining intact. Nobody in that circle was asking Elvis what he wanted to look like. Nobody was sitting across from him in a quiet room and saying, "Who do you want to be, separate from who we've made you?" Nobody except, eventually, one surgeon in Beverly Hills who had enough professional distance to actually listen. And what Elvis told him in that room, what he requested, what he brought with him, what he described with a specificity that clearly surprised even a man who had heard everything, was not what anyone would have expected from the king of rock and roll. It wasn't vanity in the way we typically understand vanity. It wasn't ego. If anything, it was the opposite. It was a man sitting in a chair, stripped of the jumpsuit and the spectacle, quietly confessing that when he looked in the mirror, he didn't see what the rest of the world saw. He saw something incomplete, something that wasn't quite right, something that could be fixed If only he could find the right face to chase. That face belonged to a real person. Someone specific. Someone whose name, the moment you hear it, will make you pause and reconsider every assumption you've ever made about Elvis Presley, about his confidence, his bravado, his iconic self-assurance. Because none of that was quite what it seemed. And the surgeon remembered it all. Every detail, every photograph Elvis brought into that room, every quiet, desperate request. He remembered it, because you don't forget the moment a legend shows you exactly how human he was. Tony Curtis, that's the name. And if your first reaction is surprise, good. That means you're paying attention, because on the surface, it doesn't make sense. Elvis Presley, the man who made women faint from Kansas City to Copenhagen, the man whose face was on more bedroom walls than any human being alive, was sitting in a surgeon's office with photographs of another man's face, pointing at the jawline, pointing at the nose, pointing at something in the eyes that he felt he didn't have and desperately wanted. Tony Curtis, for those who need the full picture, was one of the most strikingly handsome men Hollywood ever produced. Dark hair, sharp features, an almost architectural quality to his face that the camera didn't just love, it worshipped. He had what the industry called effortless magnetism, which is really just a polite way of saying he looked like he'd been designed by someone who took the job very seriously. In the late 1950s, Curtis was everywhere, on screen, in magazines, at the parties, at the tables where the real decisions got made. He was the kind of man other men studied without admitting it. And Elvis studied him, quietly, privately, in a way that never made it into any authorized biography or carefully managed press release. Here's what makes this so much more than a celebrity footnote. Elvis and Tony Curtis existed in the same stratosphere at the same time. Same era, same cultural moment, same orbit of fame and desire and carefully constructed public image. They moved through some of the same rooms, knew some of the same people, competed, whether they acknowledged it or not, for the same cultural crown. Curtis was Hollywood glamour. Elvis was something raw, something southern and electric and almost dangerous. The world loved them both, but it loved them differently. And Elvis, it seems, was aware of that difference in a way that quietly tortured him. The surgeon recalled that Elvis didn't come in vaguely. He wasn't asking for general improvement in the way most patients do, gesturing loosely at their reflection and saying, "Just make me look better." Elvis came in with intent. He came in with photographs. Specific, selected, deliberate photographs of Tony Curtis, not full portraits but close-up details. The structure of the jaw, the line of the nose in profile, the quality of the eyes at a certain angle. This wasn't admiration from a distance. This was a man who had studied another face so carefully he could describe it in clinical terms to a medical professional. That level of specificity doesn't come from passing envy. It comes from obsession that's had years to quietly develop in the dark. What makes it land even harder is what Tony Curtis reportedly said when accounts of this eventually surfaced, that he had no idea. That Elvis had never given any indication. That as far as Curtis knew, they were simply two men existing in the same world, nodding at each other across the vast landscape of mid-century American fame. He had no idea that behind the sequined confidence and the curled lip and the voice that could fill any arena on earth, Elvis Presley looked at him and felt something he couldn't name, something close to longing. And that's the question that should stop you cold. If Elvis felt like he wasn't enough, what does that tell us about the nature of enough? Here was a man who had been told repeatedly by millions of people in the most visceral and unambiguous terms possible that he was extraordinary, that he was singular, that there was nobody like him and there never would be. And he heard all of it. He absorbed all of it. And then he sat alone somewhere, looked at a photograph of Tony Curtis, and thought, I want that, whatever that is. The surgeon said Elvis seemed almost embarrassed to ask, almost apologetic, like some part of him knew how strange it was, how impossible it was, and asked anyway, because the wanting had simply grown too loud to ignore. That wanting had a cost, and it was about to start collecting. Here's what nobody wants to say out loud about Elvis Presley's physical transformation, because saying it means dismantling one of the most comfortable myths America ever built. The myth is that Elvis simply let himself go, that the pills took over, the appetite took over, the loneliness took over, and the man who emerged in the Vegas years was just the wreckage of someone who'd had everything and couldn't handle it. That myth is clean. It's easy. It asks nothing of us. But the fuller truth is messier, stranger, and far more heartbreaking than simple collapse. Look at the photographs, not the ones from the '68 comeback special, where Elvis returned to the stage lean and magnetic and almost frighteningly alive, but the ones from 3 or 4 years later, when something had shifted in ways that diet and drugs alone don't fully explain. The nose sat differently. The jaw carried a new definition. The cheekbones caught light in a way they hadn't before. People who knew Elvis personally, who had spent years studying that face the way only people close to fame ever do, noticed. They didn't always say something. In the world Elvis inhabited, you didn't say something. But they noticed. The surgeon's account adds a layer to all of this that changes the timeline. Because if Elvis was consulting on procedures with real intent, bringing photographs, having specific conversations, describing specific outcomes, then what we're looking at across those years isn't just the deterioration of a man under pressure. It's the ongoing, active, desperate project of a man trying to rebuild himself from the outside in, trying to become something his own reflection wouldn't give him. And that project, like most projects built on a foundation of self-rejection, was expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. The physical consequences were real and cumulative. Surgical recovery requires rest that Elvis's schedule never permitted. It requires honesty that his inner circle wasn't built to provide. It requires a stable psychological foundation, and Elvis's foundation, built on childhood poverty, sudden global worship, and a management structure designed to extract rather than protect, was anything but stable. Each procedure, each recovery, each disappointment, when the mirror still didn't show him what he'd asked for, fed directly into the cycle of dependency that his doctors were already struggling to manage. The painkillers that started as medical necessities became coping mechanisms. The coping mechanisms became the story everyone told after he died, while the deeper story, the one about a man who never felt like enough, got buried under easier explanations. What the surgeon described wasn't a man out of control. It was a man exerting the only form of control he had left, because by a certain point in Elvis's life, almost everything was managed by someone else. His schedule, his image, his finances, his public narrative, all of it filtered through handlers whose primary interest was preservation of the product, not the person. The operating room was one of the few places where Elvis could walk in, say exactly what he wanted, and have someone actually try to give it to him, even if what he wanted was somebody else's face, even if the attempt was never quite going to succeed. And it didn't succeed. That's the part that quietly destroys you when you sit with it long enough. The surgeon remembered, with what sounds like genuine sadness in the transcript of that interview, that Elvis grew frustrated over time. Not angry, not dramatic, just quietly, persistently frustrated. Because no matter what was adjusted, refined, or reconstructed, The face in the mirror still belonged to Elvis Presley. The most recognizable face in the world was inescapable even to the man wearing it. He could chase Tony Curtis's jawline across every operating table in Beverly Hills, and he would still wake up every morning as himself, famous, worshipped, and somehow, in the private arithmetic of his own self-worth, not quite what he wanted to be. The cruelest irony in the history of modern celebrity had taken shape quietly, behind closed doors, in the sterile silence of a surgeon's office. The man the whole world wanted to look like couldn't stand the sight of his own face. And that realization leads somewhere even darker. Let's step back from Elvis for a moment. Just for a moment, because if this story ends as a celebrity tragedy, another famous person who had everything and still fell apart, then we've missed the most important thing it's trying to tell us. And what it's trying to tell us isn't really about Elvis at all. It's about the mirror. It's about what we bring to it, what we demand from it, and why it almost never gives us what we actually need. Elvis Presley was not a weak man. Let's be absolutely clear about that. The talent was real, the work ethic in his early years was extraordinary, and the courage it took to walk onto a stage and become what he became, with no roadmap, no blueprint, no version of himself that had come before, was something most people will never fully appreciate. He built something from nothing in the most literal sense. And then, having built it, he spent the rest of his life feeling like a stranger inside it. That's not weakness. That's what happens when the world's definition of you moves faster than your own. The people around him could have helped. That's the part that carries real weight. Not the surgeons, not the doctors, not the pharmaceutical trail that's been documented and debated for decades, but the inner circle. The men who called themselves friends, who ate at his table and traveled on his plane and laughed at his jokes and told him always what he wanted to hear. There was nobody in that room willing to say the hard thing. Nobody willing to sit across from the most famous man in America and tell him that no procedure, no adjustment, no borrowed jawline from a Hollywood photograph was going to fix what was actually broke, because what was broken wasn't his face. It was the story he'd been telling himself about his face, about his worth, about what he needed to be in order to deserve the love that was already surrounding him in quantities most human beings can't even imagine. That kind of honesty would have cost those people something: access, comfort, proximity to greatness. So they stayed quiet. And the silence was its own kind of betrayal, slow, comfortable, and dressed up as loyalty. Now think about Tony Curtis, because this story doesn't belong to Elvis alone. Curtis spent his later decades navigating addiction, complicated relationships, and a Hollywood system that had consumed him just as thoroughly as it consumed Elvis, just more quietly, with less spectacle. The man whose face Elvis had brought into a surgeon's office as a template for transformation was fighting his own private war with identity and self-worth on the other side of town. Two icons, two men at the absolute peak of what fame and physical beauty could offer a human being. Both of them, in their own way, losing a battle that had nothing to do with how they looked. That symmetry isn't a coincidence. It's a pattern. And the pattern is the story. Because what Elvis was doing in that operating room, chasing a version of himself that felt more worthy, more complete, more deserving of the adoration being thrown at him, is the same thing driving every filtered photograph posted online today. It's the same thing behind every subtle procedure booked quietly, every mirror checked one too many times, every moment of looking at someone else's life and thinking that, I want that, whatever that is. The technology changes. The industry changes. The face we're chasing changes. But the wound underneath stays exactly the same. We have built an entire civilization on top of it and called it beauty culture, called it self-improvement, called it wellness, and almost none of it touches the actual thing that hurts. Elvis needed someone to tell him the truth, not about his face, about his value, about the difference between being seen and being known, because Elvis was seen by more people than almost anyone in human history, and still died feeling invisible in the ways that mattered most. That gap between the size of the audience and the depth of the loneliness is one of the saddest distances a person can travel. And he traveled it largely alone, surrounded by people who mistook proximity for care. The surgeon who held this secret for 50 years finally let it go, not to shock anyone, not to sell anything, but because some truths are too human to take to the grave. What Elvis wanted in that office wasn't really Tony Curtis's face. What he wanted was to feel like enough, to look in the mirror and recognize someone worthy of everything life had given him. He never quite got there. And the tragedy isn't that he tried. The tragedy is that no surgeon on earth could have given him what he was really asking for. Nobody could have, except the one person who never fully believed in him, himself. If this story made you see Elvis, or yourself, even slightly differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because every week we go behind the curtain on the stories famous people never got to tell for themselves.